Stanley Kubrick needed Jack Nicholson to look genuinely insane in The Shining. So he drove him insane. 127 takes of one scene. Months of psychological pressure. Constant criticism. Deliberate isolation. The line between Jack playing a man losing his mind and Jack actually losing his mind became so blurred that even the crew couldn't tell the difference anymore. This is the story of when method acting went too far. It was May 1978 when Jack Nicholson arrived at Elstree Studios in England to begin filming The Shining. He was 41 years old and at the peak of his career. He'd already won an Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, had been nominated for Chinatown and The Last Detail, and was considered one of the greatest actors of his generation. He was confident, prepared, and excited to work with Stanley Kubrick, a director he'd admired for years. Jack had studied Stephen King's novel thoroughly. He understood Jack Torrance, the character he was playing. A struggling writer who takes a job as winter caretaker of the isolated Overlook Hotel and slowly descends into madness, eventually trying to murder his own family. It was a meaty role, the kind Jack excelled at. He'd played disturbed characters before. He knew how to access darkness. What Jack didn't know was that Stanley Kubrick had no intention of letting him act his way through this role. Kubrick wanted something different. He wanted real madness, real exhaustion, real psychological breakdown. And he was willing to destroy Jack to get it. The Shining was scheduled to shoot for 17 weeks. It ended up taking over a year. From May 1978 to April 1979, Jack Nicholson lived in England, mostly at the studio or his rented house nearby, working 6 days a week on a film that seemed to have no end. Kubrick's process was unlike anything Jack had experienced before. Most directors shoot a scene a few times, maybe 5 or 10 takes if they're perfectionists. Kubrick routinely did 40, 50, sometimes over 100 takes of a single scene. Not because the actors were doing anything wrong, but because Kubrick was searching for something he couldn't articulate, something he'd only recognize when he saw it. The cast and crew quickly learned that working with Kubrick meant surrendering any sense of normal filmmaking. There was no such thing as a shooting schedule that held. No such thing as good enough. Kubrick controlled every aspect of production with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on pathological. He designed the sets himself, supervised every prop, chose every carpet pattern in the hotel. Nothing was left to chance, except the human element. That's where the chaos lived. For the actors, especially Jack and Shelley Duvall who played his wife Wendy, the experience became a kind of psychological endurance test. Kubrick would shoot the same scene over and over and over, rarely giving direction beyond, "let's do it again," or, "that wasn't quite right." The actors were left to guess what he wanted, to try different approaches, different emotions, different line readings, hoping to stumble onto whatever Kubrick had in his mind. Jack later described it as trying to read someone's mind while that person actively prevented you from doing so. The famous "Here's Johnny" scene, where Jack chops through a bathroom door with an axe while Shelley's character cowers inside, became the ultimate example of Kubrick's method. The scene was shot over the course of 3 days. Jack swung that axe through a door 127 times. Each door was real wood, built by the production's carpenters to specific dimensions. Each time Jack broke through, a new door had to be installed. 127 doors were destroyed for that scene. By the 20th take, Jack's hands were raw from gripping the axe handle. By the 50th take, they were bleeding through the tape he'd wrapped around them. By the 100th take, Jack wasn't thinking about performance anymore. He was just swinging the axe, mechanical and exhausted, his mind somewhere between consciousness and pure physical action. Kubrick kept the cameras rolling. He never told Jack why they were doing so many takes. He never said what was wrong with take 45 or what made take 91 different from take 89. He just kept saying, again, in that flat, emotionless voice that Jack came to dread. The crew whispered among themselves. Some thought Kubrick was a genius, pushing his actors past their ego and conscious technique into pure instinct. Others thought he was a sadist who enjoyed watching people suffer. Jack didn't know what to think anymore. He just knew he was exhausted in a way he'd never been before. Not just physically tired, but mentally drained, emotionally depleted, spiritually empty. The line that became immortal, "Here's Johnny," wasn't even in the script. It was something Jack improvised during one of the takes, a reference to Johnny Carson's Tonight Show introduction. Kubrick liked it and kept it. But even after Jack gave him that perfect moment of improvisation, Kubrick made him do it dozens more times. Just to be sure. Just to see what else might emerge. Just because he could. But the axe scene wasn't even the worst of it. The worst was the daily grind, the months of shooting where Jack would arrive at the studio at 7 a.m. and not leave until midnight, doing take after take after take of scenes that seemed simple on the page but that Kubrick insisted on perfecting. A scene of Jack typing at his desk. 60 takes. A scene of Jack talking to the bartender ghost. 47 takes. A scene of Jack walking through a hallway. 85 takes. There was no pattern to when Kubrick would be satisfied. Sometimes he'd get what he wanted on take 12. Sometimes he'd shoot 90 takes and use the 7th one in the final cut. The actors never knew. They just had to keep going until Kubrick decided to stop. Shelley Duvall had it even worse than Jack. Kubrick seemed to take a particular pleasure in breaking her down. He would criticize her openly in front of the crew, tell her she was ruining scenes, make her cry and then film her crying, using her genuine distress for the camera. The famous baseball bat scene, where Wendy confronts Jack on the stairs, was filmed with Shelley in a state of genuine terror and exhaustion after days of Kubrick's psychological manipulation. Jack watched this happening and didn't intervene. Later he admitted he felt guilty about that, but at the time he was so deep in his own survival mode that he couldn't help anyone else. It was every actor for themselves on Kubrick's set. You either broke or you endured, and even enduring felt like breaking. About 6 months into shooting, Jack started to change. People who knew him noticed it first. He'd always been charismatic, funny, full of energy. But as The Shining dragged on, that energy curdled into something darker. He became withdrawn, irritable, prone to sudden outbursts. His sense of humor, usually his shield against the world, disappeared. He stopped joking with the crew. He stopped going out after work. He just went back to his rental house and sat alone, sometimes not sleeping, sometimes drinking too much, trying to process what was happening to him. The role of Jack Torrance required him to descend into madness, but Jack the actor was descending right alongside the character. The boundaries were dissolving. When he filmed scenes of Jack Torrance raging at his family, the rage felt real because it was real. He was genuinely angry at Kubrick, genuinely exhausted, genuinely at the end of his rope. When he filmed scenes of Jack Torrance isolated and alone in the hotel, the isolation felt real because Jack Nicholson was isolated and alone, thousands of miles from home, trapped in a production that seemed like it would never end. Kubrick knew this was happening. He saw it. Some people think he engineered it deliberately, that the whole point was to push Jack past acting into actual psychological distress so that the camera would capture something authentic. Others think Kubrick was just so focused on his own vision that he didn't care about the human cost. Either way, the result was the same. Jack Nicholson gave one of the greatest performances in horror cinema history, but he gave it from a place of real suffering. There's a scene late in the film where Jack Torrance sits at the hotel bar, talking to Lloyd the ghostly bartender, and he says, "I'd give my soul for just a glass of beer." When Jack Nicholson delivered that line, he meant it. He would have given anything to be done with this film, to be free of Kubrick's obsessive control, to remember what it felt like to act without being psychologically tortured. The iconic image of Jack Nicholson's face pushed through the broken door, grinning maniacally, eyes wild, has become one of the most recognizable images in cinema. But if you look closely at that face, really study it, you're not just seeing acting. You're seeing a man who's been pushed to his absolute limit. The wildness in those eyes is real. The exhaustion beneath the performance is real. Jack Nicholson disappeared into Jack Torrance not through technique but through breakdown. When filming finally wrapped in April 1979, nearly a year after it began, Jack left England immediately. He later said he didn't even say goodbye to Kubrick properly. He just wanted to get as far away from that experience as possible. Back in Los Angeles, friends and family noticed he seemed different. Haunted. It took him months to decompress, to remember who Jack Nicholson was separate from Jack Torrance. He didn't work for over a year after The Shining, an unusually long break for an actor at his level. He needed time to recover, to put himself back together. In interviews over the years, Jack has been asked many times about working with Kubrick. His answers have been diplomatic but telling. He's called Kubrick a genius, which is true. He's called the experience intense, which is an understatement. But he's also said things like, "I wouldn't work that way again," and, "There are limits to what you should ask an actor to give," and, "Some directors confuse cruelty with artistry." Those are not the words of someone who looks back on the experience with unqualified fondness. Stanley Kubrick, for his part, never expressed any regret about his methods. He got the film he wanted. The Shining is now considered a masterpiece, one of the greatest horror films ever made. The fact that it damaged the people who made it was, from Kubrick's perspective, irrelevant. Art justified everything. The ends justified the means. If Jack Nicholson had to suffer to create that performance, well, that's what actors are paid for. This raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of filmmaking, about how far directors should be allowed to push their actors in pursuit of a vision. Method acting, the technique where actors draw on their own emotions and experiences to create authentic performances, has always existed in a gray area. But what Kubrick did went beyond method acting. He created the conditions for genuine psychological distress and then filmed it. He didn't ask Jack to remember a time he felt angry or scared. He made Jack actually angry and scared, then pointed cameras at the result. Is that art or is that abuse? The film industry has never really answered that question. Kubrick's methods are taught in film schools as examples of directorial vision and commitment to craft. But they're also whispered about as cautionary tales of what happens when a director has too much power and not enough accountability. The actors who worked with Kubrick most closely, Jack and Shelley especially, have been clear about the cost. It wasn't just hard work. It was psychological damage that took years to heal. There's a moment toward the end of The Shining where Jack Torrance freezes to death in the hedge maze, his face locked in a final expression of rage and madness. When they filmed that scene, Jack had to lie in artificial snow for hours while Kubrick got the shots he needed. Jack was so exhausted and cold and done with everything that he later said he actually understood Jack Torrance in that moment. The character who's so consumed by his own demons that he destroys himself and everyone around him. Jack Nicholson didn't destroy himself making The Shining, but he came close. And the brilliant, terrifying performance we see on screen is the record of that near destruction. Every frame of Jack's face in that film carries the weight of real suffering. That's what makes it so effective. That's what makes it so disturbing. We're not watching an actor pretend to go insane. We're watching an actor who was pushed to the edge of actual insanity and managed to channel it into performance before it consumed him completely. Years later, in a rare candid interview, Jack was asked if he'd do it again, if he'd work with Kubrick again knowing what it would cost. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said something revealing. He said, "The film is a masterpiece and I'm proud of it, but there are things I lost making that movie that I never got back, parts of myself that stayed in that hotel, and I'm not sure any role is worth that." That's the real story of The Shining. Not just a horror film about a haunted hotel, but a horror story about what happened behind the camera. Stanley Kubrick wanted to capture madness, so he created it. Jack Nicholson wanted to give a great performance, so he gave everything, including pieces of his sanity. And we, the audience, watching that iconic face pushed through the broken door, grinning at us from the screen, are witnessing the moment when acting became real and the cost became almost too high to pay. The Shining stands as both a testament to what's possible when filmmakers push beyond conventional limits and a warning about what gets sacrificed in the process. Jack Nicholson survived it. He went on to have a brilliant career for decades afterward. But he was never quite the same. Something changed in him during those months in England, something that never fully healed. And maybe that's the ultimate price of art. Sometimes to create something immortal, you have to leave a piece of yourself behind. Jack left part of himself in the Overlook Hotel. And if you watch The Shining closely, you can see exactly when it happened. It's there in his eyes. The moment when acting stopped and something else began.